is here. She's a constituent service representative. Does a great job with Veterans Affairs issues, Social Security, IRS, and Medicare. She manages the congressional art competition. That's a program we have that all congressional offices are able to participate in. Not all do. We do. And it's open to all the high schools in our district for their students to bring forth artwork. And then we have a panel that we enlist, and they make choices. We also have a People's Choice Award that we have. The one who wins gets to have his or her artwork hung in the tunnel that is between the Capitol and the House Office building. So hundreds of thousands of people pass it every day. We also arranged with Southwest Airlines that the family, two members of the family, get to fly to Washington, D.C. for the ceremony that we have there. And we had some very, very good success there. Michelle also manages our military academy point, West Point, Annapolis, the Air Force Academy, the Academy. We're very proud of that program because we have one of the most successful programs in the entire country. This year we set a record. We sent 7 young students from this district to West Point. We're entitled to 1. We got 7. We've got 6 into the Naval Academy, and then another year we got 6 into the Air Force Academy. So we are very, very proud of the young people. It's a tribute to the schools in our district, a tribute to those young people, and a tribute to their parents. Brian Caven, he's a communications director and also handles science, space, and technology. Where's Billy? Billy Morris, interesting program that we participate in. The Department of Defense has a fellowship program where they take outstanding young members of the tag team. All right, so we have one mic. We won't bring it around to you. The only thing we do is ask you to wait to ask your question until we get that to you. A couple of things that I'd like to just mention before we go to questions and answers. There is one of the reasons that I sought this office was to deal with the issues of threat to the United States by way of terrorism. I spent a great deal of time doing that because of my committee assignments. And one of the difficult things I think we have as a nation is to understand the concern that is appropriate for the threat that is out there in view of the fact that we haven't had a successful attack against us on our soil of a significant nature. And what I mean is a mass attack since 9/11. We've had a terrible, terrible attack at Fort Hood. We've had attempts by the the underpants bomber. We had an attempt by the shoe bomber. All of those of us who have a chance to fly from time to time understand that because many of the things that happen with TSA and their approaches to us are a result of those threats that are out there. We have in this area a major concern. Not only are we the state capital of the United States, but we have Folsom Dam, which is of a unique nature. It's actually 4 dams and 8 dikes. There's no other water structure like it in the country. A number of years ago, the head of the Bureau of Reclamation said publicly, later confirmed to me privately, that of all the water projects that they run in the entire United States, Folsom Dam is of the greatest concern to them. remind ourselves we put a lot of effort into it, we put a lot of money into it, and there are some positives as a result. Now, probably the biggest issue that we faced in the last I thought everybody could hear. Should I start over? No. Thank you. That's a little bit too bad. A little bit too bad.
Speak up, man. Speak up.
All right. Can you hear now? Okay. I just don't want that feedback. Okay. One of the biggest issues we've had over the last 8 months, certainly the last several months, is the question of what we're going to do about the budget on the federal level. I want to tell you I had a perfect plan. But 434 of my colleagues had perfect plans. 100 in the Senate have each a perfect plan, and the President of the United States had a perfect plan. And guess what? None were adopted, because none of us could put the exact plan we wanted together. So what did we come up with? Well, we came up with a conditioning of the permission to raise the debt ceiling on a beginning course to start restrained spending on the federal level to bring some fiscal sanity to it. And this had never been done before, at least in my mind. Now, someone may say they can remember what it was done. I can never recall when a raising of the debt ceiling was conditioned on spending cuts. Why did we do it, and why did it come to this? Well, in the last election, as you know, Republicans won the House, Democrats won the Senate, and the President, a member of the Democratic Party, is in the White House. That is called divided government. The question is, how do you work with that? It meant that the President had to get Republican votes in the House of Representatives for permission to have an increase in the debt ceiling. Why do you need an increase? Why do you need a debt ceiling at all? You need a debt ceiling because the Constitution gives the responsibility of the purse, the power of the purse, or spending to the Congress rather than the President. Founding Fathers thought that was important because they thought there would be greater protections on the raising of taxes and the spending of money if the Congress, which went before the people more often than the President did, were to be permanently responsible for it. So, when you raise the debt ceiling, you are granting authority for the for the federal government to spend money, what? To pay the debt. The debt is that which has already been incurred. So I analogize it to a family. You know, you're a family, and several members of your family have a credit card. And one member of your family happens to go on a spending spree unknown to the others. And at the end of the month, you get your bill. Oh my God, you look at it and you say, we didn't plan for this. And you have what we would probably say politely is a family council. You meet. One of the first things you do is you take the credit card away from the member of the family that's been spending irresponsibly. I believe that putting cuts into effect now and changing the spending pattern of the government from now going forward is like cutting up the credit card. But you cut up the credit card, you got the bill sitting there. Can you call up the credit card company and say you're not going to pay? It's not going to work very well. Do we tell those people who have bought our debt that we're not going to be good on the debt? I don't think you can do that. So I think it was responsible to pay or to raise the debt ceiling in partial response to the President's request. We didn't give him everything he wanted, but we raised it by $900 billion. But it was accompanied by cuts of more than that, $917 billion. The President wanted a larger debt ceiling increase. We said, okay, we'll give you an opportunity to have it the second go-around, but it has to be preceded by $1.5 trillion in cuts. That's kind of difficult to do. How are you going to get members of Congress to agree when there's, 435, but everybody's there in the House, 100 in the Senate, and the President of the United States? Well, what we did was we set up a system that said we will have this committee made up of 6 members of the House, 6 members of the Senate, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans that will report to the Congress. They have to report to us by November 23rd of $1.5 trillion in cuts that they had figured out across the board. All in different agencies and departments of the federal government. So you say, how do they December. You might notice one's just before Thanksgiving, one's just before Christmas. That's to put more pressure on the Congress to do it. So you look at it and you say, okay, how are you going to get them all together? Well, if we don't do that, the default position is automatic cuts go into effect between defense and other security and domestic. And they made it such that it is so awful from the standpoint of the people on my side of the aisle in terms of Defense Department, Homeland Security, intelligence agencies, and Department of State that we don't want that to happen. And they did it so that those on the liberal side wouldn't want those cuts in domestic spending, so they don't want it to happen. And it's to try and force us to come to an agreement on what we ought to do in terms of coming up with an intelligence approach to it. So that's why that was done. If that happens, then the president can get an increase in the debt ceiling that is somewhat less than the cuts that we make. Then the fourth thing we put in there was a requirement that both houses have to vote on a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Doesn't guarantee it's going to pass. Doesn't guarantee it's going to go to the states. But the last time we voted on it was 15 years ago. It passed the House by over two-thirds vote. Went to the Senate just a two-thirds by one vote. If it had that extra vote, it would have gone to the states for ratification. If it had the supermajority of states to pass it, then it would have become law. Let's say they did pass it 15 years ago. Let's say it took 5 years for the states to have sufficient numbers to ratify it. If we had the last 10 years with a balanced budget requirement in the Constitution, I believe, you could disagree with me, but I believe we would not be in the mess we're in right now. I have experience on the state level, which gives me some reason to believe this. When I was Attorney General, I had to approve every bond that was issued by the state of California. They couldn't go out to debt unless they were approved by the outside bond council, by the treasurer of the state of California, by the Attorney General. I had to sign that they met all of the laws and the Constitution of California. So we tried to figure out what the California Constitution requires. Does it require an absolute balanced budget? So I went to the best attorneys I had in the office. They were not political appointees. They were civil servants. And I said, let's look at this as strongly as we can to find out what the law really means. And we went back and we looked at the court decisions that went back to the Great Depression. And essentially we came up with an interpretation that was known at that time as the Lungren Doctrine, which was that since you have a fluctuation of revenues from month to month to month to month, depending on business cycles and so forth, you might have more revenues that come in one month than another, and you can't make sure that it's going to be exact for that fiscal year. So the way we interpreted with the best legal minds I could come up with was that you could only go into indebtedness in the state of California, that is the state, to carry across a fiscal year if you in good faith could prove that you had a reasonable prospect for paying it off in the next fiscal year and not just rolling it over. Now, I had to deliver that message to Governor Wilson and to the legislature. They were not all pleased with that because that restricted what they could do. And we had a $4 billion deficit at that time, staring us in the face here in California, which was big at the time. And that forced them to take care of that within 18 months. We actually got rid of that deficit in California within 18 months, and we were on a balanced budget position. So do I think it would have happened without that outside constraint? No, I don't. And that's why I think it is good for us to do it. Now, there's no guarantee we'll get two-thirds vote in the House or two-thirds vote in the Senate. I think it's a far better prospect we'll get the two-thirds in the House. But it will have the issue front and center for the American people to look at, to try and figure out where we are, where we're going, how we can do this. You have to understand, we are spending this year $1.4 trillion than we've got. Now, that's a lot of money. $1 trillion is 1,000 billion. So we are spending this year 1,500 or $400 billion more than we've got. We did it last year, we did it the year before. And so we are now in the position at the end of this year, well, right now, we've actually added $4.2 trillion to the deficit in the last 2.5 years. I just don't think we can continue to do that. I don't think we should have done it in the past. I don't think we should do it now. I don't think we can do it in the future. And so we have to respond. Now, I'm just going to say this at the very beginning. If people want to people and listen to people, and I will say, I'm old-fashioned. My parents taught me not to want to do that sort of thing, all I ask is that you would have respect for others. And if you would not have any all I can say is I'm very proud of my district for the last number of years that we have had town hall meetings. In fact, we've had them shown on C-SPAN where a lot of people were being rude to one another in other parts of the country. And we had thousands of people at some of our meetings. And I was very proud of the fact that my constituents showed restraint, showed respect for one another. And if you have an opposing point of view, at least let the other person be heard. And then maybe we'll get something out of this. So, now, we will open it up for questions. And,
actually, I was only asking that we could open for questions, and I thought I'd be the polite person and ask,
well, good.
rather than interrupting. Yeah.
Oh.
I wanted to ask about the Bush tax cuts that the Republicans do not want to have. They want to keep those.
Right.
And I keep hearing that it's because those people are the job creators. In 2003, when the Bush tax cuts took effect, the unemployment rate was 6.2%. Today, 8 years later, the unemployment rate is 9.1%. So where is the evidence that these tax cuts for the most affluent actually
All categories of wage.
It's not working. Tiny bit for us and a humongous bunch for them. That's the fact.
You really are showing how to be rude. You're doing a very good job. Very good job. The fact of the matter is the tax cuts are for all categories of taxpayers, number one. Number two, the fact of the matter is President Obama extended the Bush tax cuts for several more years. Based on the fact that he believed that it was...
No.
Because the
Yeah.
Republicans spread their hands on unemployment insurance.
Yeah.
Use the deficit ceiling to blackmail. That's what you did. This is too important. Our country is going down the drain. Thanks to guys.
Sir, do you want to leave or do you want to be quiet?
I'll listen. Listen a long time.
I know no economist would suggest that we ought to raise taxes in the midst of a downturn in the economy, and to suggest that the Bush tax cuts have caused the loss of jobs, I just have to think it's wrong. You and I have a difference of opinion. All right.
Yeah!
Okay, I would like to just speak on the issue of the debt ceiling.
Let me just say something.
I have to admit I'm disappointed in your vote on the debt ceiling, that you voted for that. But and I'll just deal with one issue and then see if you can disabuse me of my idea. I will listen to you. But
Could I interrupt for just one
oh,
moment?
sure.
I mean, this is the point of someone, I presume, is a reporter going over to talk to the person that's interrupting the meeting. That's the kind of thing that causes people to interrupt meetings, as opposed to listening to what other people have to say. I wish the reporter would be listening to what you have to say instead of doing that. But go ahead.
But, you know, I'm concerned because you're going to have this committee, and they're going to be split. And the guarantee that I see in this thing that you voted for is they're going to cut defense and I think even Medicare if this committee doesn't come together. And I saw in this that oh, well, I don't want to get that political, but that the government said, well, we'll raise the debt ceiling. You had a chance to shut this stuff down and put the onus on the people who were responsible for this tremendous debt ceiling, because they would have had to make the decision as to what are we going to have to cut if the debt ceiling had not been passed. They would have had to make it. Now you've hamstrung the Republicans because you're going to lose no matter what. No matter what comes out of this committee, you're going to have to yield because you yielded to the current administration and gave him $2.5 trillion to raise the debt ceiling. There's no cuts. That's a raising of the debt ceiling. And so, and I'll get to my point. I'm going on. But then, you know, you mentioned debt ceiling. Why do we have a debt ceiling? Because it's never a ceiling. It just gets raised higher and higher. I want taxes. I want these things to be cut. I want you to cut some of these programs. I saw a failure on your part to vote for yes, you won't waffle this time when your committee gets arguing and stuff like that. You won't give in and say, oh, well, we got to have this. We got to make these compromises. I want you to be firm in it. So if you can just accuse me, I will listen and tell me why you really think this is a good thing.
Because it's the best we could do. I had the opportunity recently to introduce Justice Scalia to an audience. Justice Scalia said to this group, he said, what do you think is the reason why, what is the thing that protects our freedom more than anything else? And he said, most people would say the Bill of Rights. And they would go through it and they'd say First Amendment, maybe the Second Amendment, maybe the Fifth Amendment. He said, but I don't think that's the case. He said, because I can show you constitutions and bills of rights that sound better than ours. He said the Soviet Union had one that sounded a lot better than ours. But we know what happened in the Soviet Union. He said that which protects us more than any other thing, that our freedom, is the construct of government established by the Founding Fathers. And he said, Europeans have a very difficult time understanding it. They say, you mean if the House of Representatives voted by the people, representing all the people, they vote for it, it doesn't become a law? You mean you then have to have a second body called the Senate to vote for it, and then it still doesn't become a law? Then it's got to go to the President of the United States, and he's got to sign it, and if he vetoes it, it goes back to the House, and they've got to pass it by 2/3, and that still isn't enough, and then it has to go to the Senate, it has to pass by 2. They say, that doesn't make any sense. And then he said, what is the equivalent, that is the executive? It's the Prime Minister. But to be the Prime Minister, you have to also be an elected member of Parliament. It would be as if our system required the President of the United States to be an elected member of the House of Representatives of the Senate while he or she was president. Because there they have no distinction between the executive and legislative branch. He said our Founding Fathers specifically set our system up so that no one person, no one party, no one faction, no one branch of government can get their own way in such a way that they can diminish our liberty. So you say to me, why didn't we get what I wanted? Because of the system that has been set up that requires us to get a majority in the House, a majority in the Senate, and the President of the United States to sign it, or 2/3 in the House and 2/3 in the Senate. That's why. I mean, that's a simple fact. It was not that which I wanted. I voted for cut, cap, and balance. That would have had a permanent program. That would have had it for 10 years. That would have cut far more. We passed it in the House. You know where it is? It's sitting in the Senate. They won't pass it. We did what you wanted us to do, and it sat there. So then we had this question of what can we do? How far can we go? Can we do it without raising taxes, which the President wanted? Can we require it to be a larger cut than, in fact, the raising of the debt ceiling? And, sir, I would disagree with you. These are real cuts. That's why we so strongly about them. And we caused them to start now, not 2 or 3 or 4 years from now, real cuts. If you go back to the CR that we had, the continuing resolution that we voted on in the 2nd or 3rd month, and we said we were going to cut $100 billion in the fiscal year, we only had 2/3 of the fiscal year left, or a little bit more than that. So we came up with a program that cut $77 billion. You heard all the stories about people saying you really didn't do it because only $37 billion in cuts. Well, guess what? The reason why Speaker Boehner had to go back with the plan that we eventually got and have it recalculated was because once the Congressional Budget Office looked at the numbers we were looking at, they went back and saw what the impact of the CR was that we passed several months ago and found it didn't cut $37 billion, it cut $100 billion. So we were working on a baseline that was actually lower than that which we presumed. So we went back and we added additional cuts. But you don't hear people say that. They stood up at my town hall meeting and said, you voted for something you said was $77 billion, it was only $37 billion. It now turns out it was $100 billion, and those are actual cuts. That's why it's $100 billion, not 37. So I would differ with you, sir, that we've actually spent time doing it. I mean, you may think we sit there and waste our time. We actually do try and come up with solutions. You may not agree with them, I may not agree with them, but that's why we fought so hard. If they weren't cuts, it would have been an easy thing to do. If no one was serious about cuts, we could have picked a number out of the air, we could have passed it, and gone home. The fact of the matter is, we were fighting over it because these were important issues. I'll bother you. That's not where I was going, but okay. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, folks. My name is Bob Morgan. I'm a retired military man. And I just wanted a couple of simple things. All this dialogue that we've been having, all this discussion, why don't we run the government like we would our family? Now, as far as the great amount of money that we're spending in the defense, I'm not going to complain about that. I would like for us to go back a little bit, a few hundred years in history. When our leaders declared war, they said, follow me. So, let the president, let Congress, let the Senate have all the wars they want, but they go out and take the point.
Well, first of all, on your question about families, I have to agree with you. I think we ought to operate more as families do. And have a concern about the future. I think that's very important. With respect to the issue of war, the Constitution gives the right of declaration of war to the Congress, but in most of the conflicts in which we've involved in the history of this country, there has not been an official declaration of war. There has been usually serious and persistent consultation between the executive, the president, and the Congress. I think that has been the case for both Democrats and Republicans in the past. I think the president has done that in terms of because I don't think the president consulted with the Congress with respect to what we're doing in Libya, nor do I believe he's articulated a mission there. Or when they've articulated it, they've declared a different mission on our diplomatic side from our military side. That bothers me. Because if you have two different missions, it seems to me neither one of them is going to be effective. So I did not support the president's expansion of our role in Libya, but I refused to vote against continuing to assist in the funding of our troops that were there. Because frankly, I think when the president commits the troops at that point in time, I've got an obligation to support the troops, even though I may work in some ways to limit where the president wanted us to go. Bob, where are you, Bob?
Right here.
Try and get somebody on that side, will you please?
Hi, I'm Sharon out of Milk Road, and somebody asked you, why did you fight for us? And you said, we did the best we could do. And I'm just curious, if your son came home and had a math test to study for, but he watched a couple hours of TV, played some video games, and he got a D on it, and he looked at you and said, Dad, I did the best I could do.
to say and work, frankly, long hours back there. The fact of the matter is we have a system that's set up in which not one person or one party can dictate. Now, you may not like that. I may not like it from time to time. But the fact of the matter is, it was the best we could do under the circumstances. Because we had to get 218 votes in the House. We tried to cut the cabinet balance. We voted for it. We got a substantial vote on it. But it didn't pass the Senate. And the president wasn't going to pass it. So we could have sat there and said, we're not going to give authority for the ballot or for the debt ceiling increase, and we could therefore have jeopardized the full faith and credit of the United States. And we would have, I think, properly or improperly, because the president is the head of the executive, and they told us that there were certain checks that might not go out. We would have jeopardize the payment of some individuals in this country that I think rely on those payments. I wasn't willing to do that. Perhaps you would have wished me to do that. I didn't. But I think I owe you my best decision. I also owe you an explanation of why I decided. But when I say we did the best we could, that is a honest answer as to how we could get a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate. It's not the same thing as taking an exam. It's a question of how can you get a majority. That's the way that's the way our Constitution sets up the system.
So what I'm going to ask you is, obviously we're all here for special reasons close to our heart tonight, and your decisions are going to impact a lot of us. Walk through the system that you lay out for us and see if you like it. See if your family and you can deal with it. See if you can live a life in America under the choices that you make that affect all of us.
Well, I do that every day. I do that every day. I've got children, I've got grandchildren. I'm concerned about their future. And the fact that you're a member of Congress doesn't mean that you're no longer concerned about where this country's going. And frankly, I don't question your motivations. I hope you wouldn't question mine.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak a little bit tonight and ask you some questions here that have been troubling me. I talked to you within your office while you were in Washington. My question, I the pay's gone up for executives, CEOs 298%. Corporate profits are up 141%. Yet, the most recent data from the U.S. Bureau of Statistics, when adjusted for inflation, average earnings for the average American middle-class worker have not increased in the last 50 years. And I think that affects most of us in here. In fact, the reality is that 2 jobs produces smaller after-tax income now than it did 5 decades ago when I was living in the 1960s. During the same period of time, the average income for the wealthiest Americans has gone up from $13.7 million to $263 million a year, a nearly 20-fold increase. I can give you some more numbers. How can we justify? And I heard John Cornyn just last week raise this question. I heard Mary raise the question. I've got just a couple more minutes. Not even that, a couple more seconds. Complain about 50% of the Americans, working class Americans and poor are not paying taxes. The question I have then is...
I think you said 50% of the households are not paying.
50%. You can either one works. My question is then the proposal that we should be taxing the poor and giving the wealthy a tax break in this country? And the question I have, and it brings me to the question I have, and it's this. I think we need to cut deficits, but I think we need a balanced approach. We also need raising taxes. And my question is, how can you represent us? How can you fly with both wings, sir? when you signed the Grover Norquist pledge.
Well, if your approach worked, we'd be creating jobs in California. They would. Sacramento government put a surcharge. What was the result?
Answer the question.
To the government than before they put the surcharge. I remember a number of years ago, I don't believe I was in Congress at the time, I believe it was in the 90s, they put a luxury tax on, particularly on yachts.
Answer the question.
That is the answer.
Sir, can I respond?
Wait a second, I'm trying to answer the question. I thought we gave you some time to talk, sir, and I was going to answer your question. The point I was trying to make is in the 90s we put a luxury tax on items such as yachts. It was supported by Teddy Kennedy and by Senator Kerry. What was the result of that? Yacht sales went down. The yacht industry in America, which is in the northeastern part of the United States, went in the tank. American workers lost their jobs. Shortly thereafter, Teddy Kennedy and John Kerry led the fight to get rid of luxury taxes. So my point is, on our economy. And I don't know. Well, obviously you have, Clinton actually cut taxes, by the way. We currently have some of the highest corporate tax rates in the world. Next question.
You didn't even answer it. Back here.
Hi, Lori. I'm a new public office, free congressman. I'm a resident of Fair Oaks, California, and I'm also a proud employee of Sprint. And I've come here tonight to just be heard on a different topic. I
Sorry, ma'am, I
apologize.
can't
But
hear.
one close to my heart, and it's my job. And if the current T-Mobile takeover of AT&T does go through, then we are at risk of having a duopoly in this country. We'll control 80% of the market. The only other comparisons I can make are two top oil companies only control 18%. In the auto industry, the two top manufacturers control 37%. In the banking industry, two top banks control 27%. Not only am I an employee of Sprint, I just have to say that I'm also a single mother, a dog of hundreds of your constituents. If this takeover does go through, $39 billion will be paid to Deutschland and $25 billion of it in cash. Appeal to the FCC and the DOJ and let them know that this takeover will affect American jobs at a time when we're trying to create new jobs. We need to keep them also affect competition, the consumers, our economy at large. Thank you very much.
We have a mechanism in our country where both the FCC and the Department of Justice are required to look at that. I trust that are both the product of legislation passed by the Congress and by laws as determined by the courts over the years. When I was Attorney General, we had jurisdiction in the state of California for antitrust. In some cases, we had concurrent jurisdiction. That is, we had jurisdiction over the same requests as the federal government, and we used our standards. So I will watch that. I'm on the Judiciary Committee. We will look at what DOJ does on that. At this point in time, I think it's appropriate for them to try and make their determination, take a look at that, and then see if it does do the things that you're talking about. But actual formulas that have been established over the years to figure out whether or not there is anti-competitive behavior as a result of those, and prove it with conditions. That is, the merged entity has to divest themselves of certain portions of it, sometimes spinning off other companies as a result. So we've not, I'm not on this subcommittee dealing with antitrust, but it eventually comes up to the full committee, so we'll have a chance to take a serious look at it. I don't know. You're deciding.
Yeah. It's one of, I have several concerns that I'd just like you to continue to support. I'm 35 years old and active 20-30 here in Sacramento, Carmichael resident my entire life. I'd like you to continue to support athletics in our schools so that our children can be fit and active. And I'd also like for you to continue to support arts and music in our schools. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I have to support those things, but those decisions are made at the local level by the local school district, which I think is appropriate. Sometimes we can give some spotlight on it. That's what I do with our congressional art competition, to try and show it's important for all the schools and to have the competition, and then showcase these young people as we can, and encourage the schools to participate. One of the things that bothers me from time to time is not all the schools participate. So if you know of any schools that are out there that have students that have an artistic bent that would want to be involved, make sure they are in touch with our office, because that actually is something that's extremely important. I happen to think athletics are good. I think you learn a lot of things on the team sport, rather than the Congress who happen to be involved in the team sport, as opposed to individual sports when they were younger, seem to know how to try and work to get things done, as opposed to just stopping things from getting done. Find somebody else out there, Bob. Hi.
Hello, Congressman. My name is Jacob Stolting. I'm a Boy Scout and I'm also a writer for my school newspaper.
Yes, sir.
And I'd like to ask you a question it's caused me great time in high school. And that's that year after year, I've seen talented, inspiring teachers who are untenured receive pink slips and some of them get laid off. And I've also watched as teachers that just have no passion for their job, that don't properly educate their students, have absolutely no concern about losing their job because of their tenure status. So my question to you is, also in light of what's happened in Wisconsin, is do you feel it's right to create a merit pay system in our schools, or do you feel that it's right to give some who are not the best qualified to do their jobs?
That those decisions be made on the state and local level, not the federal government deciding that. I think it was just before I went to Congress in 2005, was to pass an initiative that President Bush came up with and was supported on a bipartisan basis in the Congress, called Reason Is. I think it gives far too much power to the federal government, and I think, frankly, it interferes with teachers' ability to sometimes do the best job for their students. I happen to think you ought to have I do think it's testing so that you get an idea of how you are doing versus other students in the country and the world, for that matter. But I think it's been overdone with No Child Left Behind. When we decide on the local level, my thought is that we ought to keep the students, a good teacher is better than a mediocre teacher, and a system that protects a mediocre teacher and penalizes. Work that out, I'll do that at the local level, because I think we have made a mess of things when we've tried to direct it from the federal level. Okay, Bob, come on up here. Bob, come here now. We have somebody going through pantomime. He wants to. He works so hard. I'd hate to see him. Yes.
Hello, my name is Charles Williams, and I'm a Folsom resident, and I also am a business owner. Stated that you're working to, I quote, create jobs and heaven for job creators to work, invest, and innovate in the U.S. Most people in business only works when people have money to spend, and there is high demand for products and services. Even if taxes were at 0% and there were no regulations, in fact, the only thing we have done as Republicans as I am is to demand for business products and services here in the U.S. Business only infrastructure repairs to our crumbling roads, bridges, plan on increasing demand for goods and services here in the U.S. so businessmen like myself will have the incentive to hire new workers to meet that new demand.
I mean, there's two general approaches to try and quote-unquote stimulate the economy. One is the idea that you rely primarily on government spending that somehow will increase demand, and therefore that you try and work on economic fundamentals that will make it more likely such that they have an opportunity for more jobs. We have tried the stimulus. Japan tried the stimulus approach, it was either 7 or 11 times, and most economists would say that created what has been known as in Japan. We have a different system, I believe, which is based on having the most dynamic, most creative, most response number of years. Instead of trying to work to unleash that, we have worked in ways that's the way that you can do it. The fact of the matter is, government doesn't create wealth. The private sector creates wealth. That's not to say we don't need government. We do need government. But government is not the produced work in terms of anything I'm aware of. In terms of, voted against the president's stimulus package is because it did not front-load infrastructure. Most of the money, I think 16% of the stimulus package went to infrastructure. And most of that hadn't been built. The president joked about it wasn't coming up with a plan. I suggested that it be heavily weight-loaded, and in order to have those infrastructure projects go through, we had to also expedite the environmental review. Because in project lawsuits of environmental aid, the economy through infrastructure, they would have bitten the bullet and they would have said, all right, for this period of time, we will expedite environmental review. They refused to do that, which suggests to me they weren't as serious about creating infrastructure as they had said. Yes, sir.
Congressman, I really appreciate the fact that you started off by talking about the dam situation here in California and the potential for a terrorist attack on Folsom.
That's the three-letter dam.
Three-letter dam, absolutely. The point I want to make is a much more realistic problem, a much greater realistic threat to what kind of blowing up that dam. But just like what happened, I think it was 14 years ago, because of poor maintenance, one of the gates blew right off. It's not the only dam in California that's in this circumstance. There's 69 California dams that are in need of rehabilitation to meet basic state-level standards. They're structurally deficient. Now, I understand that you question whether or not increased spending for stimulus is going to get the economy back. My question and my point is not directed towards that at all. But our infrastructure is crumbling, sir. The I-80 between Watt Avenue and I-5 is a disgrace. I get beat up just driving out there. I just don't understand why